going to talk about whether or not the third world still needs Marx. And our first guest, we're really excited to have him on the show, is Zeyad Nabolsy, and Annie Olaloku-Teriba is also going to join in a moment. So we'll introduce her when she's on the show. But to introduce Zeyad, Zeyad is a PhD student in Africana Studies at Cornell University, working on the African philosophy of culture, African Marxism, as well as the philosophy of science and a modern African intellectual history. So Zeyad, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really grateful that you were able to come on. So to maybe start with a very personal question, when I think about the first time I encountered Karl Marx, as it was with a lot of people, it would have been in high school, and my parents are Tanzanian, so I heard a lot about Julius Nyerere, but he was always this sort of mythical figure. I understood that he was a socialist, didn't really understand what that meant. And so at I think 14 years old, had a library card for my closest library, took out a copy of the Manifesto, and that was, my first introduction to Marx. So I wanted to know how did you first encounter Karl Marx?
Right. So I just want to say thank you so much for having me on the show. This is a good question. I mean, okay, so 14 for you, okay, you beat me, definitely way older than 14 for me. I'd say maybe 17 or something, 17, 18. So I had an interest in reading history. And, eventually, obviously, even if you're reading sort of anti-Marxist history, they always hint at this, they call it like the reductive economistic Marxist view and move on or something, right? So I got curious, okay, I want to see what is this reductive economistic view of history. Because I guess I have this contrarian strain. So I said, okay. So the first thing I read, I think, was the Communist Manifesto, which is, I think what most people read. And it was sort of illuminating to sort of have this understanding, okay, we can have these structural explanations. Because I was reading a lot of stuff that had a kind of personalist approach to history or something, right? Great people doing things, failing and doing things, and so on. So that was sort of my introduction, was through history, I guess, interest in that sort of stuff.
I was going to say my first encounter with Marx is the Manifesto, of course, because the 1980s in South Africa, when I was in high school, is it's highly politicized. There's like a mass struggle going on, or some people might characterize it as a revolution. And people are just passing around this manifesto, and you can read it. It's very simple, right? It's actually like a tract, like a pamphlet. But I would say I really started reading it in university, at the University of Cape Town, and I would credit probably somebody like Mary Simons, who was the daughter of Jack Simons, who was and Ray Alexander, who was a trade unionist. Jack Simons he wrote a book called Class and Color, which is a classic from the sort of first half of the 20th century. And he was in exile at that time, and his daughter taught at the university. I think right before that, she may have been detained. But anyway, and I really enjoyed, having classes with her, political theory classes, comparative politics classes, and that's where I started reading Marx. And I would say historical materialism, even if I'm sort of wavering now and then, it remains sort of my way of trying to make sense of the world. Your point about personalized structures versus these, this kind of understanding the world, superstructure, base, and so on. Like, you could start from that. You can, history moving and so on. In any case, how would you say, as a follow-up question, how have your ideas to Karl Marx's ideas changed or evolved, like over time?
Right. So I guess I would say, and I think that happens to a lot of people, I developed a kind of interest in sort of what we can say the philosophical aspects of Karl Marx. And actually, I was sort of doing my undergraduate in engineering and finished that, but I developed an interest in philosophy. So I ended up doing a master's in philosophy, and I ended up doing it on Hegel because, obviously, you need to have some sort of understanding of Hegel to grasp Marx. And people obviously debate the extent to which this is, stringent requirement. I don't think you should force people to read Hegel before, before they read Marx. But I would say that over time, I've sort of, I would say I've come to sort of see the limits of a certain philosophical approach to Marx that overemphasizes maybe the normative aspects in his thinking, which and those, there is obviously lots of debates about the extent to which Marx developed a normative theory of any sorts about justice or equality or something like that. And I think over time, I've sort of developed an interest in the kind of more, if you can say, the critique of political economy as a project. And I had to sort of try, okay, I'm going to try to teach myself some classical political economy so I can understand its critique. So that's sort of where I'm at now. And also as a function of time, I've sort of moved away a bit maybe from attempts to answer the charge of racism and Eurocentrism directly through Marxology, because you see that a lot, right? People go, they excavate Marx's, we can say minor writings to see, okay, well, actually he said this about this place, and we can track, a development in his understanding of Indian society in the 19th century. And now I'm more interested in sort of the global reception of Marxism, a kind of global intellectual history. So that's sort of where I'm at right now.
I'm also reading Hegel at the moment.
That's good.
It's too tough. It's a lot. I mean, I'm interested in what you just said now about you making this transition away from sort of getting bogged down in these allegations that Marx was a racist, and that case being built out of isolating the fragments in his work. What is the nature of that allegation? What do people sort of point to in alleging that Marx was a racist, or in some instances an anti-Semite? And how would you you say you think that's kind of peripheral to the main thrust of his project, which is a critique of political economy, but how does it figure in to all of that?
Right. So if you take, for example, debates about the Asiatic mode of production, because that's one way, that debate has sort of raged on for a very long time. And so obviously this concept has a lot of European intellectual history of the 18th and 19th century behind it, and Marx is drawing on that for sure, that there is no doubt. But essentially, for example, people might point to his description of India in his article of, I'm trying to remember, 1853, I think, where he talks about, a kind of stagnant society where nothing really happens, at least at the level of structural social transformation. So you have like political revolutions, this dynasty going in and, conquering the subcontinent, and another one coming along. But, he presents us with this image that, maybe at the level of what he describes as sort of like the village communes, nothing is happening. All what's happening is the people in power are changing, but the structure is the same. And people have said, well, this is sort of Eurocentric and racist. And it's understandable why people would think that, because again, obviously, you guys already talked about Edward Said. So one prominent element in Orientalist discourse was the claim that in the East or in the Orient, nothing ever really happens, changes, at a fundamental level. So it's understandable why people would try to assimilate that to a kind of Orientalist discourse. But I think in response to that, you have people like Kevin Anderson, for example, who wrote this book, Marx at the Margins. I think came out like 2010 or so, I can't remember. But he tries to see, okay, he looks at how Marx actually Marx's views develop on India after the 1850s and so on, where he develops a kind of more nuanced understanding. And I guess I would say I think this approach is very useful, but I think there are limits to this approach, because for me it would be much more interesting to see, to look at the reception of Marx in India by Indian intellectuals, for example, in in the 20th century, and what sense of that? Because there is a way to make discourse about Eurocentrism itself Eurocentric, right? Where you just keep talking, okay, we'll keep doing these excavations.
Yeah, I mean, Annie's just joined us. I've got a question about what you've just said now, but I'd like to bring on Annie to the show. Welcome, Annie. We're so happy to have you on today. And if you don't know yet, Annie is an independent researcher based in London, working on the legacies of empire and the complex histories of race. And we're talking about Marx and race at the moment. But before we continue with that conversation, Annie, we want to start with something a little bit personal. We were just reflecting on how all of us first encountered Marx in our lives. So we want to ask you too, when did you first encounter Marx? How did you come to know of this gray bearded guy always sitting very serious? Yes, for portraits.
Oh my God, that's such a funny question to ask me, because in fact, this person is now my best friend, and I met him about, will be going on 11 years now. And the first I ever met him, he was my guide at his school. I was doing a competition, and he was telling me, oh, you should read this like workers' paper. Have you heard of Karl Marx? And it's so funny because I didn't tell him. He was the first person who'd ever said Karl Marx's name to me until we had been friends for about 10 years. But yeah, that was a really transformative period of my life. I kind of grew up in a working class neighborhood, had these instinctive feelings about the world and something being wrong with the world. Had, like, I guess, what some of the worst experiences of the excesses of capitalism that you could have in the imperial core. And then all of a sudden I had a language to describe that in. I had a reason to understand some of the experiences I'd gone through. And I had a methodology for thinking about how I might resist in a way that's effective. And when I got to university, my reading of Marx obviously paired with my reading of Fanon. And it became even more liberating, but happy to kind of answer more questions along that line. It's really funny because I don't know if anyone knows him. His name is Barnaby Rain. But yeah.
I know Barnaby, yeah, good comrade. And I mean, it's interesting what you've just said now, that your reading with Marx in university overlap with your reading of Fanon. We're talking about Marx and race just now, and Zeyad, before you joined, was talking about Marx's understanding of the Asiatic mode of production and how this was a methodology that he applied to understand, the development of capitalism, or the non-development of capitalism in Asia and the East. So I suppose the question is, when, Zeyad was saying that it would be more interesting to look at how Marx is received by contemporary intellectuals. Marx's critique of political economy, at some point, people say that it's insufficient insofar as it doesn't fully capture the sort of the superstructure that society, let's just say, right? It's too narrow, it's too focused on the economy, and it ignores these other elements of society which are just as important to social life, such as culture and ideology and so on. And in both Africa and in India during the colonial period, that was a significant critique leveled against Marxism. So when it comes to understanding his reception there, I mean, what was the basis? I mean, I'm asking you guys to explain a lot, but what was the basis of that critique? And does it warrant a departure from Marxism, or is it compatible with Marxism? I mean, Fanon, for example, some people say he isn't a Marxist, some people say he is. How do we tell?
I'm happy to jump in. I think that there are two ways of conceiving. I mean, obviously there are loads of traditions of Marxism, but there are two ways broadly in the way that I conceive of it, of like understanding Marxism as a marker for a political project. One is to say that this guy called Marx came along and like wrote this magnum opus, which contains within it everything about our society and how and everything about human history and how we might kind of resist the ethical and moral incursions of capitalism today. There's another way of conceiving of it, which I think is what really great Marxist tradition, which I'm going to trace from Lenin to National Liberation, Black Panthers, are doing. And they're saying, you know, even Stokely Carmichael kind of falls under this tradition of Kwame Ture. They're saying, you know, here's this guy called Karl Marx. He cannot have invented the notion of wanting to free ourselves and live collectively. But what he offers us is a set of tools for thinking about the world and interrogating the conditions that we are faced with that are helpful, right? And so Fanon makes a comment, I believe it's in Concerning Violence, where he talks about in the colonial situation, Marx must be stretched, right? Crucially, he doesn't say Marx must be rejected. And I think that sometimes people are looking for Marx's work to do everything, anything and everything. And I think both Marxists do that and anti-Marxists. But it's more helpful to kind of think of him as having a very specific project looking at the development of capitalism in Europe, Western Europe, making some generalized comments about the broader kind of geographical frame, but speaking to a moment in the late 19th century. Marx could not have conceived of the developments in imperialism that happened in the early 20th century. Marx could not have conceived of the rise of neoliberalism. And so when we're asking him to speak to that, to offer us a blueprint for getting out of that, rather than a methodology for understanding that, we're asking too much of him. Sorry, I didn't, it does frustrate me a little bit.
Zeyad, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with Annie that, you know, when we're talking, you know, so to take sort of the question of this discussion, do Africans need Karl Marx? I think, yeah, very much to Annie's point, we're asking, is Karl Marx someone who has provided adequate analytic tools that we start from, right? We're not asking, should we only read Karl Marx or end with Karl Marx? And I think to that extent, we can definitely talk about the adequacy of the analytical tools that were provided. So to go back, for example, to this question of Orientalism, racism, and Eurocentrism, I think if we look at sort of what historical materialism is as a theory of social transformations, we would see that even, yes, of course, we can point out to elements that are Orientalist in Marx's writings and racist in Marx's writings. But what the historical materialist worldview does, I think, is undermine a lot of, especially the racist civilizational discourse at the conceptual level, which was prevalent in the 19th century, which continued to be prevalent into the 20th century, and until today, in fact.